considered one of the worst moral crimes imaginable. We must all care, or at least we must all pretend as if we care, yes, or must be seen to care about the plight of others much worse off than ourselves. And the result of this, and I think this is Tocqueville's point, seems to be to create new moral hierarchies of compassion, where one's superiority is demonstrated by our heightened sensitivity and feeling for others. And it is precisely this kind of misplaced compassion, asking the question, who is the most sensitive among us? A very Rousseauian type question. This kind of misplaced compassion that is, I think, one of the psychological determinants of what we would call today political correctness. Obviously a term Tocqueville does not use, but you might think of the way in which the language of pity, compassion, sensitivity has so much shaped our moral vocabulary, ways of thinking about ourselves and judging others. If you don't believe me, watch almost any daytime afternoon show like Oprah or any of these other shows, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Of course, you've all seen these shows. I think many more times than I have, but nevertheless. Compassion. This is the first or one feature of democratic social life. But it is not the only one. It is connected, or at least it exists alongside another. And at the core also of the psychological life of modern democratic citizens, Tocqueville writes, is a profound sense of uneasiness, of anxiety, that Tocqueville calls by the French term inquiétude, a word that maybe is difficult to translate into English. Inquiétude, anxiety. In an earlier translation, this was called restlessness. In this particular translation, you have restiveness, to indicate the sort of perpetually dissatisfied character of the democratic soul. I mean, in many ways, the democratic soul, like democracy itself, is never complete. It is always a work in progress. And this feeling of perpetual restlessness for Tocqueville is tied to the desire for well-being, and by that he means particularly material well-being. It is the desire for happiness, measured largely in terms of material happiness, that is the dominant drive of the democratic soul. In many ways, Tocqueville brings to his analysis of democratic restiveness, you can see in it, something of the aristocrat's disdain for the acquisition of, you might say, mere material goods for which most of us have to work so hard to acquire. I mean, perhaps more than anything else, this is what perplexes Tocqueville about democracy. Democracy meant for him predominantly a kind of middle-class way of life, bourgeois life, made up of people who are constantly in pursuit of some obscure object of their own desires. I mean, consider the following passage, one of my favorite from the entire book, from a chapter entitled, "Why the Americans Show Themselves so restive in the midst of their well-being." Let me read it at some length. In the United States, he says, a man carefully builds a dwelling in which to pass his declining years and sells it while the roof is being laid. He plans a garden and he rents it out just as he was going to taste its fruits. He clears a field and he leaves it to others to care for the harvesting. He embraces a profession and quits it. He settles in a place from which he departs soon after so as to take his changing desires elsewhere. Should his private affairs give him some respite, he immediately plunges into the whirlwind of politics. And when, toward the end of a year filled with some leisure still remains to him, he carries his restive curiosity here and there within the vast limits of the United States. carrying his restive curiosity wherever he may go. He will thus go 500 leagues in a day in order better to distract himself from his happiness. What a wonderful phrase, to distract himself from his happiness. Death finally comes, and it stops him before he has grown weary of this useless pursuit of complete felicity that always flees from him. Does that passage sound like anything we may have read here? Does it not sound as if it is modeled almost exactly after Plato's description of the democratic soul in Book 8 of the Republic? A person who is constantly moving, constantly restless, constantly unable to concentrate or to bear down on the one or very few things that give life a sense of wholeness and meaning and integrity. Here is the democratic man, restive in the midst of well-being, constantly moving ahead or moving to, as he says, distract himself from his own happiness. Tocqueville writes here, it seems, with a kind of disdain for a life understood as a constant and, in his view, self-defeating pursuit of happiness. The desire for well-being, you might say, becomes the right, almost the right of the democrat, and the more one desires happiness, the more it eludes our grasp. So just after the sentence, the sentence just after the passage I just read, Tocqueville says, "One is at first astonished to contemplate the singular agitation displayed by so many happy men in the midst of their abundance." And you can sense Tocqueville's irony in his use of the term, so many happy, the distractions, the agitation, complete agitation displayed, he says, by so many happy individuals in the midst of their abundance. There's a world of social commentary condensed into those sentences. His combination of words like agitation and abundance in the same, again, in the same context as the pursuit of happiness indicates for him that this way of life is more likely to bring frustration and anxiety than it is to bring us satisfaction and repose. And he traces this continual restlessness back to what seems to be for the democratic social, for the democratic individual, the virtual obligation to be happy. I would ask you in this context, if you have some time, to read Darren McMahon's wonderful new book on a history of happiness, to give you a little bit of an indication of the way this term has been used throughout its history, and the way in which, in many ways, the obligation to pursue happiness, to restiveness, that kind of restiveness, is the source of so much, as he puts it, the singular melancholy, he says, that the inhabitants of democratic lands often display amid their abundance. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness have become what one person once called a kind of joyless quest for joy. And this is the second feature, this restless or restive character of democracy. And finally, the third feature of democratic psychology that I want to focus on is this idea of self-interest, or self-interest well understood, as Tocqueville calls it. This is a doctrine with which everybody is familiar, from courses on moral psychology, on utilitarianism, to modern courses on, in economics and game theory and other things, where the term self-interest is regarded almost as sort of a talismanic, has the almost talismanic properties of explaining all kinds of human behavior. But Tocqueville means something very specific by self-interest, or self-interest well understood. It is in one sense the kind of, you might say, everyday utilitarianism, not in any strict sense of the term, with which we are instinctively familiar when we hear when we hear or are told things like honesty is the best policy and things like this. It seems simple and obvious enough, but it in fact has a very complex and difficult history. By the time that Tocqueville wrote these chapters in The Democracy, theories of self-interest had long been a kind of staple of European moral philosophy, going back to the 17th century at least, going back to people like Hobbes and others. The question is, what work does this idea, this concept of self-interest, rightly understood, do for Tocqueville? In the first place, he understands it somewhat differently than I think we would. When we hear the term self-interest, we are likely to think of it as opposed to, or to think of its antonym as indicating some kind of altruism. While interest or self-interest is thought of as inherently self-regarding, altruism or something like that is an other-regarding disposition, regarding the welfare, well-being of others. But when Tocqueville talks about self-interest, self-interested behavior was put forward by him as a kind of comprehensive antonym to behavior motivated by vanity, by honor, and above all, by the concept of glory. Terms, remember, thinking going back to Hobbes in some way, and Hobbes' concern to replace ideas of vanity, vainglory, and pride with a notion of, fear of death, kind of self-interested behavior. While glory was for Tocqueville and others associated with war and warlike pursuits, interest, self-interest, was invariably associated with commerce and peaceful competition. In contrast, in other words, to the aristocratic concern with fame and honor, self-interest was regarded as a relatively peaceful or harmless disposition, leading us to cooperate with one another for the sake of common ends. The pursuit of self-interest has a kind of unmistakably democratic and egalitarian impulse behind it. The pursuit of self-interest is something literally everyone is able to follow, even while such things as honor and glory seem to be by nature unequally available to different people. And into this debate between an ethic of honor and glory and an ethic of self-interest, or self-interest rightly understood, enters Tocqueville, enters Democracy in America. He begins his chapter called How the Americans Combat Individualism by the Doctrine of Self-Interest Rightly Understood with the following sentence, with the following observation. He writes, when the world was led by a few wealthy and powerful individuals, these like to form for themselves. They like to form for themselves a sublime idea of the duties of man. They were pleased to profess that it is glorious to forget oneself and that it is fitting to do good without self-interest, like God himself. This was the official doctrine of the time in matters of morality, speaking of aristocratic ages. I doubt that men, he says, were more virtuous in aristocratic centuries than in others, but it is certain that the beauties of virtue were constantly spoken of. Only in secret, he concludes, did men study its utility. You might think about that passage, perhaps, in section. But note that Tocqueville adds to the concept of self